To prep you up a little bit, sort of what,
Yeah.
yeah.
Hi, I'm Dave March. Welcome to the Land of Confusion podcast, where we interview interesting people. Paul?
Howdy, I'm Paul O'Brien. I am your resident Texan and a appraiser out in Houston.
And tonight we're meeting up with a friend of mine, Clark Summers, who I met on Ricochet, as also known as Postmodern Hoplite. And we've had him on the show in the past for some interesting conversations, and we're hoping to talk about that tonight. So, Paul, you were asking about the Palestinian situation. Did we want to get into that? Because I certainly had noticed it myself. One day I'm walking down to get breakfast, and my city hall has 1,000 people in front of it, all carrying pro-Hamas signs. And I'm thinking to myself, well, we got a problem here.
Yeah, I would love to get to that, but first, just so the audience gets 100% familiarization, because I do have some people who have been tuning in. Clark, David, I think, understated a bit. You are a terribly interesting person. So if you could give us a brief introduction on who you are and why your commentary is so insightful, we'd love to just get into that and take it from there.
Well, thank you very much, and gentlemen, I appreciate being invited to join you this evening and have this conversation. As you said, my name is Clark Summers. I spent about 30 years in the Army, in the Army Reserve, National Guard on the Reserve component side, and over the course of that 30 years, I spent about a third of my career as a combat arms officer in mechanized infantry, and about a third of it in Army watercraft as a transportation officer and Marine terminal officer. And then I spent the last third as a chemical warfare officer. So it's a little bit unusual to have three separate branches across the whole combat arms, combat service support, combat support roles. So I did have something of an unusual career. In the midst of that, in addition to sort of the usual training and education requirements that go with being an officer, surprisingly, the Army gave me permission to attend the Navy War College about as a mid-career officer, as a captain and a major, 03 to 04, and then for my sins, the Army actually sent me to the Army War College as well. So I had a chance to get the senior level training, what sometimes is jokingly called the charm school for those who are getting to the senior levels and the senior ranks. So I was very fortunate that the Army gave me a good, healthy dose of graduate school level work, and that actually led to my getting a master's degree in international relations, as well as a degree in strategic studies. From that, I leveraged that after retiring, and went and pursued a PhD and managed to step into academia. So I now teach in the politics and government department at Belmont Abbey College in Belmont, North Carolina, where I teach both introductory politics, U.S. Constitution, but I've also been very fortunate that the Abbey has let me develop an international relations program. So we've started with an international relations minor, and I have my aspirations that perhaps the program may grow beyond that. So it's kind of an interesting mix that of a very enjoyable and full career in the Army that started in 1983 and ended in 2013. So I had a chance to see quite a bit of change, both in the strategic picture that the military focuses on, but as well as changes in the world in broad brush strokes. So that's a little bit about me.
That's awesome.
And so, Paul, I know that before we began, you had mentioned, and Dave has kind of teed up this question of Palestine. And so,
well,
I would ask one clarifying question. I can put on my retired Colonel 06 hat and look at it from a military perspective, or we can talk about it, and I can swap hats and put on my bow tie and fedora, and we can talk about it from an academic international relations or foreign affairs perspective. They're two very different perspectives.
hmm Well, one thing that I would personally like to hear from your opinion, because one thing that, and I wanted to say also, I study political science at the University of Houston. We have a very passionate international relations program there. So I love hearing your passion. That's what builds departments. So I really do wish you the best in your endeavors in that. Um, One thing that, one political observer to another, is when observing the Israel-Palestine situation, one thing that is very apparent to me is that the amount of politics that isn't involved with it. What I see from my as a third party viewer is there's a lot of this that's a PR game that's been building over decades. And I was curious to your opinions on the roots of where the PR war is taken. Because if we look at the mainstream media, Israel's just getting its tail kicked on the world stage. And even before this, from the United Nations, getting almost 200 sanctions put against Israel over the last couple decades. They have really lost this PR war, and this took time to build. And I'm curious to your perspective, either on the academic or the well, I really think the academic one is the way, because you're more on the ground with this. Where do you think the roots um, of this counter Israeli viewpoint come from seemingly people who have no skin in the game, kind of like myself? I'm a Catholic. We're born and raised Catholic in West Houston. I ain't Jewish. I ain't Muslim. Why should I have an opinion on it? Is what I say. But they somehow managed to get us to have opinions on it. So I was wondering if you could opine a bit on that, just sort of the beginnings.
Well, I can't help but draw the conclusion, just again, looking back over the span of the last 30 to 50 years that I've been aware. It's funny. Some of my earliest memories as a boy was the television. I couldn't tell you why, but seeing pictures of Moshe Dayan in the 6 Day War, and seeing it on my family's little black and white television there when I was even before grade school. And yes, these are deep-seated and long-standing issues. The problem is that whether we look at them from the perspective of, is Hamas a legitimate state actor, or is Hamas a terrorist organization and an illegitimate combatant organization, largely these academic questions come back to Hamas has been very successful, as you say, in winning the information war and winning the propaganda war. And they've been able to do that. The only conclusion that I can come to, again, as a fellow Christian, I'm not Muslim, I happen to be Anglican myself, but I teach at a Roman Catholic school. And so this whole question of, is this a just war? Is Israel conducting a just war? Do they have a legitimate casus belli, a cause for the war? And likewise, does Hamas, if they are a state actor, do they have legitimacy? And what Hamas has been able to do, particularly in the last 13 years, has been to reframe what was pretty much boilerplate anti-Semitism. Sometimes you hear the expression Islamofascism, because there's a great deal in common in the ideology between that of Hamas and its various allies in the Middle East, and the associations with the precursor of the Palestinian organization during World War II, which was informally allied with Nazi Germany. And so these ideologies go back much, much further than the immediate conflict. What I find interesting is that this pretty much standard boilerplate anti-Semitism has reinvented itself into the guise. It's now wearing the clothes, as it were, of contemporary progressivism and anti-Western dialectic. That there is the oppressor and the oppressed.
Mm.
There is the colonizer and the indigenous. And Hamas has been very successful in essentially rewriting and rebranding itself to sell itself to Western progressives, particularly in academia, that their struggle is that of an oppressed minority and oppressed indigenous people. Now, the fact that this is a historical fiction, by any objective review of the facts as they exist on the ground, really kind of becomes secondary. Once the propaganda has been accepted and internalized, confronting those who advocate that propagandic view, pointing out the truth to them is a very, very difficult task. And I find that quite frankly, in the absence of individual personal trust, Paul, if you and I were close friends and there was a degree of trust between us, one-on-one, I might be able to convince you or lead you to a point where you can accept what you've been taught for years in your college classes, in fact, may not be true. But in the absence of that personal trust, you have no reason to believe me. And as a matter of fact, I'm exactly the face that you've been warned not to believe because, well, quite frankly, I'm a 60-year-old white man. I'm a 60-year-old white man who spent 30 years in the military. So, of course, I can't be trusted. Mm-hmm. And therein presents one of the real problems about confronting Hamas. The Hamas's propaganda efforts, which really have been accelerated since Hamas took control of Gaza back in between 2005 and 2007, they've essentially been unchallenged. Israel attempted to isolate and let the world deal with Gaza. And as long as they could avoid an open confrontation, they assumed that, at least my reading of Israeli domestic policy has been, we can outlast them and our good in Israeli society will eventually overcome the evil of Hamas, because the Sunni Arabs of Gaza will eventually get tired of living in misery and will want what we have. And in fact, that just turns out not to be the case.
Yes, no, actually. Last week there's a British broadcaster or YouTuber named Meyer Tusi, and he's the only one I've seen covered this. But he's talking about how there's actually a very large scale protest movement in Gaza against Hamas amongst their 20-year-olds. And we're getting absolutely no press on this, which is shocking. You would think Israel and Western media would be talking about this.
Well, something that you brought up, and Clark, I think you did a real good job putting the first toe in the door on it, was Hamas's ability to make itself the punk rock position. Because what's surprising to me is, why do we even care in the first place? You have 15-year-olds who have a position on Gaza, on the Israel-Palestine thing, which is it's dumb. They have not a clue the history, the circumstances. They only are educated through social media. But I draw the contrast between what you were saying of they have used boilerplate anti-Semitic issues as the initial spear to move into it, because I like to compare and contrast two conflict areas. We have Israel, Gaza, and then just a stone throw away south of it is Yemen. Yemen regularly sees combat, drone strikes, frankly, stuff that we're seeing on TV right now quite regularly. Never makes the news, never gets or seldomly gets a peep in the United States. It doesn't get too much lip service, but for some reason, every single thing that happens in Palestine is worth talking about. And I liked how you were initially bringing up how have they framed themselves into making people care about them, because one thing that is always that I sometimes ponder is, why do we care about this Middle Eastern area when there's another one that's just south that has similar activity going on? And what are the method, like what is it Hamas doing differently that, let's say, the groups in Yemen or Syria aren't doing to get this same level of sympathy, where every single thing that happens, okay, we're talking about it, everybody's talking about it, it's worth talking about, let's go to the UN and we're going to go talk about it. I was wondering if you could expound just a little more on that.
Well, I would, yes, but before, don't let me vector away from that one. But David, I have to say, that from your lips to the rest of the world, I'm thrilled to hear that there is any level of organized protest within Gaza against Hamas, and these are brave young people, because Hamas doesn't brook dispute. They don't have internal dialogue seeking to reach the Hegelian mean. No, their mode of dealing with dissent is kill the dissenters. So I'm thrilled to hear that there are young Gazans who are saying no, even if it's just a Pyrrhic victory, even if it's nothing more than just get the word out that there are those in Gaza who are not represented by Hamas, regardless of that they happen to live there, or that the UN recognizes Hamas de facto as the legitimate ruling entity within Gaza. Now, Paul, to come back to your observation, it's impossible for us to sift out these differences without looking at where is the root, the source that is providing the funding, the support, the technology, whether it be the Houthi, whether it be within Syria, whether it be Hezbollah in Lebanon, or Hamas in Gaza. And that comes back to Iran is making the move now that the Obama administration, starting in 2015, started working on it in 2013, but really openly since 2015, in seeking to disengage the U.S. from the Middle East, made the choice that if the regional hegemonic power was not going to be Turkey, and the Obama administration made the decision it wasn't going to be the U.S., who do you leave that's going to be the strong central organizing power? The Obama administration made the overt decision that they were going to promote Iran into that role. What we're seeing now is, in fact, the fulfillment of the Obama administration Middle East policy of U.S. withdrawal and establish Iran as the hegemonic power that will control and ensure order within the Middle East. One reason why the press doesn't pay much attention to Yemen is because the White House really doesn't want to talk about Yemen, and has no interest in exploring, in sharing with the American people why that particular conflict is related to the conflict in Palestine. One, because we have an inarticulate president of the United States who is uncomfortable talking details with the American people, whether he's comfortable with those details himself or not. He's not a particularly effective communicator. And so his handlers avoid putting him in situations where he has to answer or talk about an integrated or complete United States foreign policy with regard to the Middle East, because all of those various spokes come back to what's the relationship to Iran. And Iran, who we've technically been at war with since 1979, and whether we acknowledge that we're at war with Iran, Iran believes that they're at war with us, and for whom they're able to frame Israel as being the local proxy of the United States. And insofar as they can, as long as they have that objective of defeating, diminishing, minimizing, and ultimately destroying Israel, because anything that they do to hurt Israel hurts the United States.
Mm-hmm.
One can debate whether or not promoting a détente with a Persian Shia regime within the context of Dar al-Islam that is going to become essentially the caliphate over the Sunni Arab nations. Whether that was a good, coherent, strategic objective for the United States, but that was what the Obama administration sought to do, and we're seeing now the success that they basically had with it. Because go ahead.
I apologize. Yeah, I wanted to jump in because there's a word that you threw out there that I really liked. Articulate. Now, sort of taking the present, projecting forward with current Republican candidates that don't have a chance, but still they have a microphone. There's one way, like you said, to look at this from the Iranian perspective, that Israel is potentially a proxy. But when you have the Nikki Haley's on stage saying, you know what, let's just bulldoze them. That doesn't, to me, there's something more overt in that form of signaling, or rather it's a banner. Like we're trying, because I've heard this even when I was an undergrad, that Iran is the hegemon of the Middle East. And as much as you try to elevate Saudi Arabia, it's still Iran. And
there are three traditional people.
Right. And the thing is, there's a way you can use Saudi Arabia and Israel to sort of try to check.
No, the three traditional aren't, though, or it's not Saudi Arabia at all. It's Egypt, Turkey, and Persia. You choose one of those three.
Right. Well, they've been trying to pick and choose. But my question is, from the U.S. policy perspective, because you're immersed in it, where do we go from let's help Israel to Nikki Haley coming on a presidential stage saying we need to go to war with Iran? Not if they do something, we just need to go to war with them. Like that's, and I think there's other representatives who have echoed more sentiment. Where is the conservative establishment perspective, you think, truly on Iran? Is it more of a let's do this as a checks and balances international relations standpoint, or is it just we need to, I really don't even have a reason to this day. It's we just need to deal with them now.
Wow, Paul, it's I wish you would ask me some tough questions. I mean, these softballs are just I feel like Casey at the bat with just watching the first two pitches go by. Forgive me, I'm stalling shamelessly, because the fact of the matter, Paul, from my perspective, I don't see that there is a coherent a coherent Republican perspective. There is not a coherent voice in foreign affairs on the Republican/conservative side of the aisle at this time. The Republican Party is so deeply divided against itself that no coherent foreign affairs voice can sift through the static right now. And because domestic, as you well know, domestic policy is always going to ultimately be the driver of 70 to 80% of the electorate in their choice of their candidate. And foreign affairs, even recognizing that foreign policy is so predominated by the executive branch, the president is supposed to be generating constitutionally the majority of foreign policy with oversight from the Senate and the legislature. But the fact of the matter is most U.S. presidents end up reacting to foreign affairs, but they run on domestic. Mm-hmm. So what we have is of the three candidates currently on the realistic candidates on the stage, one dominant has no coherent foreign policy. He reacts. Sometimes he reacts well. Sometimes he reacts in a wholly incoherent manner. Sometimes he stumbles into a good end. Other times he seems not to have any clue of what the benefit of a coherent, unified policy would require. Now, in the case of Mr. Trump, I'm not convinced that he was ever well served by either the Department of Defense or the Department of State, because those whom he appointed to be the link between the institutional administrative Department of State and the administrative Department of Defense, who were absolutely dead set against any success on the behalf of Mr. Trump. And so they continued to see the world and act according to what they institutionally perceived was best for them as institutions. They weren't worried about serving the president because they weren't interested in the president being successful. Mr. Trump, having no real understanding of how government, at least the relationship between the constitutional government and the administrative state, how it works, the man seems to me he demonstrates a middle school level understanding of how government works. Now, in theory, that should be fine. But when Department of Defense, Department of State, all of the agencies of the federal government are actively working against him, each for their own institutional benefit. Mm-hmm. It's not the Department of Defense and Department of State were working together. They weren't. And I saw that firsthand back during Iraqi freedom, in particular, OIF 1 to OIF 2, and then subsequently when we studied some of those problems when I was in grad school. And to say that the different agencies of the government were aligned against President Trump, but they weren't aligned with each other. They had different agendas.
Right.
And so we then go to Nikki Haley, who worked for President Trump, seems to me to be a capable and a perfectly sound, competent executive based on her track record in South Carolina. Do I agree with all of the decisions she made? Of course not. Do I agree with her neoconservative predispositions to want to solve the world's problems from America's perspective by deploying force? If I were advising Governor Haley, I would say, with all due respect, ma'am, you don't have the military for it. And anything that anyone coming from across the Potomac, from the five-sided building, who's telling you that you can just, as president, project power to go do these things, they're lying to you. We don't have the military capability at the current time until the U.S. begins first reorienting its military from the national strategic level and downward and orienting all of the support functions to make that happen. To talk about overwhelming force against any foreign power at this time is at best hopefully optimistic.
You're right.
This is once again coming from a man who I have a deep and abiding love-hate relationship, but in the end, the love of the service that I was in for 30 years remains. I don't want to see the Army fail. I don't want to see the Army not be able to meet the tasks placed upon it. But Governor Haley is talking about a robust foreign policy, with a military, and that's Navy, Army, Air Force, Marines. I'm sorry, I don't count Space Force. That's,
There's a very interesting theory I heard about what the real purpose of Space Force is.
So to that end, and that leaves Governor DeSantis. And Governor DeSantis is trying to thread the needle domestically of not speaking against President Trump, because he hopes to recover that block of voters. He knows if he insults, if he openly challenges President Trump, he's potentially loses that entire 40% of the Republican Party.
Right.
But neither, and to his credit, neither is he going to come out and speak from a position of ignorance that the U.S. can simply respond with force because our military simply doesn't have that strength at this time. And so he's now in the uncomfortable position of neither pleasing the Trump faction, nor is he telling the establishment GOP what they want to hear. And part of that criticism is when President Trump was President Trump, he never explained clearly what was our strategic end state for any of the various conflicts that we were in. He's not alone in this. No president since 9/11 has come to the American people and explained clearly, these are the national strategic objectives that we're going to achieve. Here's the end state. Here's what victory looks like. Not President Bush, not President Obama, not President Trump, and sure as heck, not President Biden. And that has to be done. If you don't unite the American people behind clearly stated and achievable objectives, defining what victory looks like, we will continue to flail.
Correct. And excellent response. Thank you for that. No, I tend to agree. And I think that's just the learned habit of U.S. politicians not to speak of accomplishment, but simply improvement. Great case scenario. I've cut the deficit. Classic. It's improved. Right? That's the most shameless example. Is I cut the deficit.
Yeah.
Oh well. What was it before? Before you took office, and where's it took it now? We don't talk about that. We only talk about.
I think one of the major problems is that none of the current presidents have had any military experience, and George H.W. Bush. Love him or hate him, at least when he went into Iraq, he, like you said, stated the objectives, achieved the objectives, and then went home.
Yes, and there is also a general lack of self-awareness too. I think, to your point, Clark, this was something that I see people have the debates about all the time with China specifically. Unless you're planning to use nukes, there's no conventional circumstance where we win against China. We simply do not have enough bullets. That's the scale that we're fighting here. And I tend to agree with you. There is a general, at least a sentiment, there is a general lack of self-awareness with U.S. politicians, the way we negotiate. And there's a bit too much bluffing going on. And the problem is one of these days somebody's going to call our bluff. China is going to go to Taiwan.
The Chinese never bluff.
Yeah.
I would.
Well, at least this current generation.
Well, we bluff. It's the question: is somebody going to call our bluff? Because that's one thing that Trump didn't do a lot. He actually did drone strike Soleimani. That was earth shaking. He actually followed through with a lot of his threats.
Yes.
Yep.
And that established a level of deterrence I think the whole country hasn't seen in over a decade. The ability to call to threat and actually follow through with it. And this is one of the things that's, like you're observing, and like anybody can observe, if you have friends and colleagues in the military, it's not there anymore. Who's going to fight these fights? where is the supply going to, especially when you're keeping track of how much we're sending over to Ukraine? What's our production look like right now? By the way, how are you paying for this? By the way, all those factories that you just sent the stimulus money to, they're all on strike. So what's these
even more importantly, who's going to like you was 2 years ago, it's down 10, the army was short 10,000, the military is what, 50 or 60,000 down this year. If you raise a generation of kids who hate your country, they're not going to join your army and fight your wars.
Well, there's a certain element of, and no, I mean, here's the thing. There's a certain element of justice to it as well. There is the unpopularity of things like the Iraq War, but I'll be honest. I'll give you some context first. I was very much military bound when I was younger. I applied to the Air Force Academy, got my nomination, didn't make the cut, and sequester happened the same year, so my chances weren't that great because they cut the class size in half. I was set on that, and then I went and did ROTC at U of H, and I was intent on going on that path. But while it didn't work out that way for me, I had a lot of colleagues who did take that path. The amount of people who had a good experience was dwarfed by the amount who had a bad experience, either during and after. And the thing is, there is an element of justice. You don't have to hate America to not want to join the military right now. You just have to talk to somebody who served in the last 10 years, and not everyone, but most people will tell you, don't do it. Don't do it. They don't treat you well. They tell you you have benefits. They don't follow through with them. Don't rely on them either. At the university, people's VA benefits were often denied, or not denied, but delayed to the detriment of the students themselves. So I'm not there has to be some accountability given to the military in the way it's conducted itself the last 20 years, and also acknowledge that, they're lying in the bed that they've made. And this is a question I have for you and I'm sure you're aware of what I'm talking about. Yeah. This is a good question I have for you. How does the U.S. military, or maybe specifically the Army, if you want a tighter scope, repair its reputation with the general public and turn about a optimism for joining the military? Because I would say when Trump got elected, the 2 years after, when the economy was booming, there really wasn't a good reason to go into the military, even if you wanted to, because you can make more money in the private sector, going off. And there was a lot of opportunity under Trump that even if you had some, patriotism draw to you, patriotism wasn't no, I'm going to sign up because it's the right thing to do. How do you think the military rebrands or repairs that spark in people?
Well, gentlemen, you may have noticed and might have seen just in the last, I would have to say I saw it in the last couple of weeks, but it probably been his last several months, is that the Army institutionally recognized that what they had been doing was a failure, at least in terms of their recruiting campaign. And so the Army has introduced essentially a rebrand of the post-Vietnam, the second run of post-Vietnam, right at the start of, we call it the Reagan buildup. We need to give credit to President Carter. It actually started the last 12 to 18 months of the Carter administration. But Reagan gets credit for it because it really hit its stride in the first 2 years of his administration. But the fact of the matter is the Army realized that it had to change its perception to the public. And so the be all you can be, and what it is, and they showed a whole variety of different scenes and settings, particularly soldiers jumping out of airplanes, airborne troops, soldiers plunging into freezing streams and low crawling and smoke swirling and camouflage.
High testosterone activities.
Yes. Okay.
It's like
And
they're copying the
that
Russians
helped.
or something.
But alongside of that, behind the advertising campaign, the Army was really bootstrapping itself out of the malaise of the post-Vietnam and introduction of the all-volunteer force. And it took the Army about 10 years to really turn that corner. I joined the Army in 1981. I was commissioned in 1983. The difference between when I went to basic and when I was commissioned, and then from when I was commissioned to when I did my infantry branch course and was a platoon leader in an mechanized infantry company for the first time, and looking at just within that period of time, the Army as an institution was on the rise, because the young officers who had been company commanders and battalion commanders, captains, majors, some lieutenant colonels at the end of Vietnam were now the colonels and generals that were driving this change. They didn't want what they had inherited, and they wanted to turn the Army into what it could be as an institution that was both proud of itself, proud of what it could accomplish, and could meet the nation's expectations. Not necessarily the government's, but the nation's, that the people of the United States could be proud of us. And I think that we did. We achieved that. And we hit this peak that in 1992, we had Desert Shield, Desert Storm. Now, that was a remarkably simple operation, relatively speaking. It was a one corps operation, a very discreet, accomplish a very straightforward mission, which we were able to do. It also revealed all of the various challenges that we were going to have to face anywhere else in the world, because what tends to get overlooked is that Desert Shield, Desert Storm, it took us basically 6 months to position all of the necessary forces to accomplish that end. When we got to fast forward to 2002, and the decision has been made that we're going into Iraq, there were 3 potential targets. Iraq was the one that drew it really was a no-brainer.
Yeah.
If the U.S. is going to project power to accomplish the New World Order, it's got to be here. Okay. And it still took us nearly a year to position all of the necessary forces to accomplish what was essentially still a single core action to jumping off from where we had been in 1990, 91, 92. Now, Paul, I go into all of this just to reveal that from that point forward, because the National Command Authority did not have a coherent vision of what they wanted to accomplish, the Army essentially was left with, you guys figure it out. Well, that's not a good way and approach to run an army, to run a service. The Navy was told, okay, this is going to be a ground war. Army takes the lead. And so from the start of Iraqi freedom onward, the Navy got perpetually downscaled in terms of its regeneration, its strategic mission. What was it supposed to do? It had a very limited role in what was happening in Iraq or Afghanistan, which were really 2 theaters of the same war. The Marines essentially reinvented themselves to prove we're tougher, we're better soldiers than the Army. Give us the ground mission because we're better than the dog faces. And that kind of silly inter-service fighting had the result of the Army lost its focus as an institution. The Navy lost its focus as an institution. The Marines reinvented themselves to essentially be mechanized infantry. And the Air Force was pretty much allowed to fritter away and invent their whole thing. They invented a whole Air Force Light and doubled their slice of the defense budget. I'm exaggerating there, but you can tell I have a very low opinion of Space Force. Mm-hmm. The point is that from 2003 onward, that there was a loss of strategic focus in all the services, and we haven't yet regained it. Mm-hmm. And now the Army is attempting, and you see it in the advertising, they're attempting to rebrand themselves to their target audience, which quite frankly is young white males of the middle class who are physically fit to serve in the Army. They're trying to appeal, and the problem is that the senior leadership of the Army, as it currently stands, doesn't actually believe their own propaganda. They don't believe their own recruiting. How do we know? Because they have willingly taken the Army, because this is what Congress wants. They want the Army to be a laboratory for social engineering. And you cannot simply eliminate all of the generals and senior enlisted who their entire career has been predicated upon telling Congress, telling the institutional Department of Defense what they want to hear with regard to social engineering.
Or what they want to hear on anything.
Well, yes, but in particular, this is what affects readiness.
Right.
And a good example of that is the Department of Defense, the Department of the Army, openly defied President Trump's attempts to walk back acceptance of transgender and transsexual soldiers, as from the simple perspective of these soldiers add nothing to the readiness of the fighting force. Readiness, deployability was downgraded in order that the Army institutionally could appeal to the members of Congress who ultimately were controlling their funding. Now, the other side of that same coin. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Paul. You've raised your hand twice, and I've gone right past you.
Yeah, well, it's. I wanted to actually dive into something that you're kind of going into and expand on it a bit. It's one thing to talk about the Army as an institution, but I think there is a other element that I think has come about the last 20 years, and maybe this is my own ignorance due to my age. I'm turning 30 in a month, so
you're a youngster.
Yeah, right.
I'm curious if it's one. Obviously, the problem is leadership, but it's one thing that I've hypothesized a bit is that it isn't just that they're picking bad leaders, but bad leaders are all they have to pick. Because something that was sort of pitched to me when I was in the ROTC program, and there was a viewing of your talents. One thing that was often offered up was when you hit the 0405, if you're really good at what you do, go private sector. And specifically, and this is something that I truly, sincerely believe, the strength in the U.S. military is its logistics. The one thing that we have better than any other army in the world is logistics. Russia is a great example of why, the numbers don't mean anything, because our U.S. specifically U.S. Army logistics. I mean, Army Airborne, sorry, second to none. Nobody else can do what they do, and they are only able to do what they do because we have a mastery of logistics in a way that no other army does. And the thing is, though, when you're in 05, how do you retain talent when you've got maybe an administration you don't like, but Amazon sitting here saying, hey, you do a real good job fueling those Apaches. You want to come over to our warehouse system and do a similar job with drones. We'll pay you $300K a year. Here's a signing bonus, also stock options. How do you compete with that? How do you retain talent? Because I I don't know if options like that existed in plenty pre-90s. To me, I've always seen, like, the way I was growing up, like, at least with older folks, bringing me up in my early teens who were in the military. The military was a profession. You know, this is something you dedicate your life to. But now it's a stepping stone to something else, and it does offer some incredible opportunities. Specifically with, I mean, the top secret security clearance is a big hot ticket item for a lot of people to obtain. But when you have people of talent, if they're getting scalped by, you know, corporate America, and I'm not gonna dog them either. I mean, these are excellent offers that they're offered. How does the military instill that level of, this is a profession, and put this sort of thing where somebody for some reason declines these outstanding offers from, you know, corporate America, where honestly they'll probably be utilized for their skill sets probably better than the military will, because if we're not at war, you know, like, I have all this talent, all the skill set, how are you even going to utilize me or I'm not wording this correctly, but will my talents be used to the best of their
I
ability?
just want to,
We'll have
before Clark
competition.
answers the question, I just want to point out this has historically been a problem for all militaries throughout time. I was just reading a book on the Austrian Hungarians last year, where they were having the same problems with all this talented people are being stripped out of the military. But it's just to think it's just now. It's not.
Well, the offers are excellent, because the 05s and 06s, they're not destitute. They get well compensated, but Amazon's like double it, triple it, with bonuses, stock options, and I mean, they can't compete. And I'm curious because it's one thing to get people in just to, you know, put butts in seats. It's another thing to, on the 05 up level, to retain talent. How do we retain talent, specifically when there's an element of patriotism, you know, that's kind of like the administrations are kind of and then you kind of get where I'm coming from. What do you think?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Yes.
I'd say that it's a combination. Okay. What I'm going to share with you, Paul, is what I not entirely unrealistically, or I jokingly say that I'm about to talk heresy.
Okay.
I'm going to share some apostasy. And among my fellow, you know, senior officers who are retired, particularly those who finished a regular Army 30-year career, and the fact that I came from the reserve component side of the house, they'll simply dismiss what I'm saying is, well, you know, what does he know? He was just a reservist. And I think that in that very attitude reveals the problem, and is what I argue, and what hopefully, if I ever become a better writer, and a whole series of articles, and eventually research that I seek to get published, which will really make me unpopular with my you know, my active component counterparts. I believe that the America needs to return, the United States needs to return to its historical and traditional model of a very small regular Army active component and a large and expansive reserve component that provides the surge capability necessary to one, retain those individuals on active duty who show the skills, show the talent, have the perspective, but understand that that regular Army can never function and operate without the depth, the strategic depth, and the operational depth of the reserve components.
Right.
That we literally have to change the entire paradigm that the military across the board, and the U.S. Army in particular, has functioned under since 1954. You talked about the professionalism of the military services, the Army in particular, because that's what we happen to be talking about. And yes, but the problem is that when professionalism becomes seen as an end in itself, without without being kept in the context of that professionalism is a means to an end. It is a virtue insofar as it achieves some greater good or virtue. Just like liberty for its own sake is free speech for its own sake is not enough of an end. Free speech has to be guided by right virtue, by the foundations within a virtuous society. And I like to refer to John Adams in this case. He recognized that the freedoms inherent in our Constitution were to the end of sustaining and supporting a righteous and virtuous people. So too with the military, that when the U.S. military, when the professional model achieved its absolute peak, when it essentially had won the war, as it were, of what's the right balance between reserve and militia forces and a small professional regular army. And over the course of the 20th century and really the experience of World War II sealed the deal, as it were, that from 1954 onward, with the passing of the Selective Service Act and conscription, the professionalists, those who advocated that professionalism is demanded of its own and true military efficacy can't be reached without it, without once recognizing that a reserve officer could still be a professional in every sense of the word, other than it wasn't their full-time job.
Right. And that's something that, it's the God's honest truth. The best talent is not in the armed forces. Your best logistics guy is working in Amazon. Your best engineers are working at Tesla, SpaceX, Boeing. Your best finance guys are working at banks. It's because the private sector can retain the end to God's honest truth, utilize talented individuals. And
yes,
that is such an interesting.
So to answer your point, when those talented 04s and 05s are hitting the 20-year mark of their career, they're bailing. The most talented ones are bailing. If they've made it to 04, they're going to stay to 20. Whether they make lieutenant colonel or 05 or not almost becomes secondary. If they've already made the decision, once I hit 20, I'm out. Because they're getting out at about the age of 42 to 45. And they still have 20 years in front of them, that when they're at their peak productivity for the rest of their career. Only now, they're not having to tell their spouse, oh yeah, we have to move every 18 to 36 months. We have to move the whole family to the other side of the world. And oh yeah, in the midst of that, I'm going to have to do a 12 to 13 month hardship tour. And I'm going to be even in some other horrible part of the world. That for Army spouses who have put up with that and realize that, yes, there can be some very rewarding benefits. But ultimately, I don't care how dedicated that soldier is, when confronted with, do I love my family well enough to put my family ahead of my career? The ones with true virtue are going to put their family first.
Exactly.
And the ones that choose their career, well, quite frankly, they were headed to divorce anyway. Yeah. Because their priorities were screwed up. They're putting whatever they perceive as being their objectives ahead of their family.
Sad truth of it. And what you lay the foundation for, I think, is my next question. In your personal professional opinion, what does, because I don't have an answer for this actually, what does the ideal 05 up, like the what is the ideal person that is an 05 with the mind to go to 4-star general, Can you describe who that individual?
Well, unfortunately, I've had a similar conversation with that before with Clark, and I think he's like,
oh, you have?
I wish I knew how to do that, was his answer.
Oh, no, well, that's just it, though. It's with the premise that we're putting on, because here's the thing. Clark's 100% right. If you're talented, have a family, you put your 20 years in, there's more good reasons to leave. Good reasons, not just because I don't like the administration. No, you have good reasons to take a different path, logical ones at that. But to what Clark is saying, if we're going to go with the premise that there's supposed to be a professional military, what does a 30-year general look like? That, and I love the way you worded it, that a virtuous man or woman follows to become a general with a 30-year career. What does the virtuous general of 30 years look like that's got the talent? Because you're right. And this is a view I hold, and I didn't want to say it because it's kind of mean. If you are talented, people are chomping at the bit to say, no, 20 years is good. Come work for us. Come work for us, please.
David, forgive me. You're going to hear. You've heard some of this before.
Yeah, that's okay.
Paul, I owe it to the Army. I owe it to all of my fellow officers to be absolutely honest and candid with you before I go any further.
Okay.
My career goals, and I was blessed with a wonderful spouse who was very supportive, and I was a soldier when we met. She didn't sign up to be a regular Army officer's wife, which is one reason why I chose to go reserve components. So I willingly, the Army was my first career, and so when I reached the level of being considered for general officer, I honestly, I wanted the job. I raised my right hand and I said, yes, here am I, Lord, send me. I wanted, and I expected to be a general officer. I expected to be selected for 1-star. I had my career path laid out. I expected that having been selected for 1-star, I would then be 2-star. And I expected to be a 3-star general when I finished my career. Well, as I like to tell people, clearly I wasn't given the spiritual gift of prophecy. Because when I reached 06 and I got to my mandatory removal date as an 06, I got my orders, and I think I sat there for 3 days looking at the orders in my hand on a Friday going, surely the General Officer Management Board is going to call me between now and Monday when these orders go effective. Mm-hmm. And it turned out not to be the case. So, Paul, I owe it to you to say that I wanted to be a general officer, and I expected to be a general officer, and it was a bitter pill for me to swallow that I wasn't selected. I also understand in hindsight, there were some I'm sure some very good reasons why I wasn't selected, not least of which is I have no talent for the interpersonal skills that I have observed in all general officers of being able to frame and craft the politic answer to a difficult question. My mind doesn't go there. I tend, when faced with a difficult problem, I may end up talking my way and wasting everyone's time, but my mind immediately goes to what is the blunt or straightforward answer. As a unit commander, I could be very successful doing that when I was a battalion commander and then as an 06 commander. When faced with a tactical problem, that kind of bluntness as a commander, as a leader, it can be a very effective personality trait. As a general officer, unless you're in a relatively small set of circumstances, that type of bluntness doesn't necessarily serve you well. And then there's another aspect of that, being able to perceive what is going to provide institutional success that also reflects on your own personal reflects to your own personal benefit. Not most, that's the wrong thing to say. Many of the general officers that I worked with recognized, in addition to having this ability of political skill to work a room, to be able to, no matter who they're talking to, largely determine what do they want to hear and give them the answer that they want to hear that doesn't commit me to anything.
Mm-hmm.
A skill I don't have. But I also observed that as general officers move from brigadier to 2-star, 2-star to 3-star, that the officers that they are mentoring, training, and developing behind them very much continue to see them in that same light of being their senior commander, senior leader. I have friends and associates who we haven't been in uniform together for 10 years. But when they pick up the phone and call me, or when I'm chatting with them, they'll always say they call me sir, or they refer to me as colonel, and I'll look and go, Dave, please, it's Clark. I mean, that's just, oh no, it's like, oh sir, you'll always be Colonel Summers. You'll always be the battalion commander. And I understand that. This is the real benefit, that when Raytheon hires a retired 2 or a retired 3 or 4-star general out of the DoD, out of the Joint Staff, they're buying that networking of all of these colonels and 1-star generals or lieutenant colonels who are still in the logistics world, still in the acquisition, still in a position to influence what the Army institutionally buys, and whether or not a particular weapon system is a good fit for a coherent strategic mission really is not. That's not the final deciding factor. Is the purchase of this weapon system going to benefit the program that either I just left, or those who were my mentees, those who I was bringing along with me? Is it going to validate and reinforce their importance when they go to Congress and they're sitting across the table, and the senator from Michigan is grilling them on why isn't this new weapons platform or this new vehicle platform being built in Michigan?
Yeah.
Well, the natural instinct of wanting to please that senator, combined with the fact that this particular general worked for the guy who is now vice president of acquisitions for, vice president of defense programs for this same company. And this incestuous relationship between the senior leadership wanting to tell the civilian oversight what they want to hear, knowing that it's ultimately going to benefit that. Let's go back to our hypothetical 04 or 05 who's retired at 20 years and is now working for Amazon. They're making pennies compared to what that retired 3 or 4-star is making, being the lobbyist or the representative back to the DoD or Department of the Army or Joint Staff for any one of countless acquisitions programs. All of these acquisition programs, which should be coordinated by a coherent national military strategy, and they're not. So within the Army, you have competing programs for acquisition and weapon systems that are competing with each other for defense dollars, and no coherent strategy that they're being built towards. And the reason why that occurs is because, going all the way back to our model of professionalism, because no officer, either flag rank or above or below, rarely are officers held accountable because they don't stay in a position long enough that they can be held accountable if a program fails. You notice that when the U.S. lost in Afghanistan and retreated, essentially abandoned an ally in the field, not a single general officer was disciplined, fired, or otherwise even publicly upbraided. All of the general officers all pointed at the White House and said, "We did what we were told." The White House pointed back across the river and said, "Well, we just did what the generals told us." Both cannot be true, that neither side is responsible and the other side did. It's a logical fallacy. Either the generals are lying, or the White House is lying, or both. But they both cannot be telling the truth. And that's why I point to and say is what we saw in Afghanistan was the culmination of what professionalism turned itself into from where it started in 1954. And when we reach the U.S. defeated in Afghanistan in 2021, and not a single general officer had the character to stand up and say, "I was the commander. I lost the war. I will immediately retire and submit my letter of resignation. And if Congress chooses to demote me to a permanent rank of 2-star or 1-star or 06, I will accept that punishment because I failed."
Yeah.
Forgive me, Paul. I get to ranting.
No, Clark, that was sorry. I was just soaking all that in. That was gorgeous. And the last like 20 seconds of you speaking, I was like, gosh, I would have loved to sit in a class with you. I just, I love hearing.
No, I'm not sure my American Constitution students would agree with you, but
I loved it. No, I mean this is why I studied it, because I love this subject, and I was just that whole speech. It's reminiscent of other professors I've had where I'm just like, this is good. Like because you're right. What you said makes a lot of sense. That's reflective of what a lot of the complaints I've heard, and it makes a lot of sense when you review the history of procurement, development, like the SCAR for the rifles. Like
either one of you ever watched the movie The Pentagon Wars?
I have not. I actually haven't.
Watch it. It is about the creation of the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle. It's played as a dark comedy, but it will show you exactly how the procurement system in the United States.
Yeah. And that's what I think. Like the F-22, I think was. I think the F-22 was silly to create when you already had dominance with the F-15 and F-16. It was just and then multiply that or exponent that by 10 with the F-35.
Yeah, I originally was pretty skeptical of the F-22 until I went to school with a couple of F-22 drivers, and what they shared with me about what the capabilities were. I was prepared to say, okay, maybe my earth pig knuckle dragger, but when I then extend that to see the abomination of the F-35.
Well, I don't contest its capabilities. What I contest is its necessity. I think the F-22 is overkill. And time has proven that to be the case. The F-22 wasn't a little bit better than what its competition was. It was worlds better. And to the point where it's like, well, how far was the F-15 off? Oh, it was a lot better too. That's one of the things that as a F-15 enjoyer, and who's a big fan of the aircraft. I was just, why don't we make the next F-15? Why are we spending all this money on making a new craft when you could just make better F-15s, F-16s, and F-18s? It just, and it's funny that Top Gun even throws that admission in by flying the F-18 as opposed to the F-35.
Well, you know why they had to do that, right?
No.
The American government, the military wouldn't let them fly F-35s.
Understandable. That's not an unreasonable ask. But no, that makes sense, because there is a weird coming in and out of technologies in the last 3 decades. That, because I was, as a kid, I mean, I was nuts about that stuff. I followed all of it. I was a geek for that stuff. That's what I was really following as a young person. And that was a question I would have, is like, wow, we really seem to be changing our mind a lot. Also, like, as a kid, you think, oh wow, it's F-22 kicks ass, but then as an adult, like picks up business acumen, you're just like, this is kind of overkill. Like, we spent a lot of money to.
If the F-22 had been fully fielded, and here's where I will give my Air Force brothers and sisters their full marks. That I have a natural tendency, being a ground pounder and a knuckle dragger, to see the A-10 as being the apotheosis of all combat aircraft. Looking at it from my perspective, perhaps you can understand. But what the F-22 provided in terms of not just immediate, but next and second generation beyond the current. So we're talking through 5th gen, potentially into 6th gen.
Right.
And we built so few of them, instead of building out that capability and making it the new extended platform that's going to take us into mid 21st century. This whole silly worldview of we can build the perfect single-use aircraft, and of course we can make sure that there's a component that's built in every single state of the 50 states, so that Congress never kills it.
Here's that I helped,
Yeah, it's
and that's
and to that end, it's when a Neanderthal like me can look at it and say, no aircraft can ever be perfect in every mission for each service. But that was what they attempted to do with the F-35. And I point to it as just simply being, this is indicative of both the challenge and problem between the services. It's why I'm so down on the Space Force. It's not that I think we shouldn't have that domain of capability. I don't see why it has to be a separate, entire bureaucratic branch that becomes one more institution that now worries about protecting itself. You earlier you heard me refer to the institutional army, and I actually kind of anticipated, Paul, that you were going to ask that there are really two armies. There's the institutional army that exists whether we fight wars or not. It's, as a matter of fact, fighting wars gets in the way of the institutional army. Right. And then there's the operational army. And the operational army is made up of that portion that's the actual war fighting capability, combined with the tactical and operational level logistics that become the enablers. And that warfighting capability often very much exists in tension with the institutional army.
Right. And movies have been created.
Yeah. If there was probably one factor that most contributed to the fact why I wasn't a good fit for the General Officer Corps, is because my whole career had been focused on and being a part of that operational army.
Yeah.
And that's who I am.
Right.
I appreciate the necessity why an institutional army is going to exist, but I argue that it should be as small as possible, and that the operational army should be embedded within the broader nation, and that's where that capability should reside.
And that's, man, that I at risk of making this into another excellent monologue, I'm just going to ask it anyway. What do you feel is different from, or what was the delta of change in mindset between John Marshall's army, and of post World War II, or no, pre World War II, or on the drive over there
Yeah.
of Marshall's army. Would you consider I'm going this real time. Would you consider Marshall a operational first general or an institutional first general? And because Marshall, to me, I'm a big fan of Marshall. I've read his biographies. I love reading about him. To me, he's a general that seemed to be able to do both. I was kind of curious to your commentary and how we strayed away from Marshall's army and to where we're at today, and why maybe it fell out of favor.
I'm appreciating that there's much that General Marshall should be admired for.
Mm-hmm.
His experience after the Great War, and recognizing that that the regular army had to standardize the training model, and that training doctrine was as important as tactical and operating. We didn't really have an operations scheme at that time, but tactical and strategic scheme, yes, important, but that the regular army had to have an effective standardized training model that was institutionalized, and that was initially capable of being that training cadre, that the concept of the regular army, insofar as long as the regular army remains small, and the expectation that the American military concept was small regular army, expand to become a national army, or by way of volunteers, draftees, whatever. But
the ability to shift gears.
Yes, and that served. One, it laid the necessary groundwork for the training of the National Army that was going to fight World War II. Full marks and full credit to Marshall, where Marshall revealed that he was, if not more of an institutional army man, but at least equally an institutional army leader, was that when the National Guard divisions, starting in 1940 and 41, were getting mobilized and being standardized in their training on the regular army model, Marshall led the way. He led the path of removing all of the senior leaders from National Guard units and replacing them with regular army officers who had had no more experience, no more training, showed no more promise, other than the fact they were regular army, and most of them had come out of West Point or one of the other military schools. And that without any consideration of whether or not the officers being replaced were actually not fit for duty, the simple fact that because they were National Guard was all the criteria that was needed, and that the replacement of a generation of officers who, simply because they had been regular army, were deemed to be superior. And when one looks at the performance of these officers in actual combat over the course of World War II, one realized that one can see there was no justification based upon the performance of these officers that they should have been replaced. And then after World War II, Marshall was largely, although he had gone from chairman of the Joint Chiefs to, and then was largely a much more ceremonial position, but he goes from chairman of the Joint Chiefs to become Truman's Secretary of State.
Yeah.
Then he becomes Secretary of Defense. And by the time that he becomes Secretary of Defense, who then follows as president? Eisenhower. Yeah. And so when the Defense Reorganization Act of 1954 goes into effect, we're seeing the culmination of two successive generations of regular Army officers who have reached reached the level that they now control all the levers of power. And they've made the argument that you can't rely on the reserve components. The National Guard cannot be relied upon. We have to expand the regular Army because the threat is the Soviet Union, and they're going to attack in Germany. And so the regular Army has to be large enough to immediately respond to the Soviet Union. And the only way you can accomplish that is by the full professionalization, which means a large standing Army, and we purposefully do not rely upon the reserve components.
And to be honest, I can understand their perspective, because what you're drawing up here makes a lot of sense. And the missing component from then, or rather the component they had then versus the component that we don't have today, and among other things, is one, under Eisenhower and Marshall, it's more centralized because you have collective identification of leaders of the military that have spanned over a decade at this point in time. But what's really different is you have a cohesive vision that is informed with experience, which we don't have today.
Yeah, I would not want to suggest that I doubt that Marshall's strategic vision of recognizing that against the Soviet Union at the start of the Cold War, we wouldn't have 6 months to respond. We wouldn't have 12 months. We wouldn't have 18 months. That whatever forces we had to be prepared for immediate deployment, and they had to be forward deployed. I understand the strategic vision.
Right.
I don't fault that. What I fault is the unintended consequence of essentially enshrining a perception that once it became institutionalized, no one challenged it.
Right. And that's the thing, is it's short-sighted to the extent that, one, term limits exist, two, you're not immortal.
Yeah.
It's just the succession is not guaranteed.
The other interesting thing about this is that I've never really thought about it before, but that's also at the same time we're seeing the professionalization of all the so many other sectors in the American and Western economies, in academia, medicine, all these other things, and even lawyers start going from, used to be lawyers was an apprenticeship, and now it's law schools and journalism. We just saw all these, the way we used to do things, become professionalized everywhere, much to the detriment, I think, to everyone.
Well, and this is something that, that has degraded so much to this day and age. And this is something that I think David wanted to talk about a bit more initially at the beginning, which was regards to your students.
Do we have time for that, Paul? We're running out of minutes.
I know we're coming up on 90 minutes. Clark, are you comfortable going another half hour, or do we want to wrap this up?
I would have to say I do have finals tomorrow.
So why don't we?
But I would like to let this go. Let's continue the conversation, and I hate to cut this off.
Okay,
sure.
Fine by me. I just have to go for a second. Hold on. Go ahead.
Okay. So we'll wrap it up. We'll start wrapping it up right now. All right. So
let's, I do want to touch on this before we talk about my students, is at the same time that Marshall, that the Army is, all of the services, that this professionalization, which started back in 1875.
Right.
Okay. So we're not talking about something that just happened in the years between, the Great War and World War II. This was the culmination of a number of historical trends. But I believe it was in 1955 that Samuel Huntington publishes The Soldier and the State. And in it, he identifies the three traits that define a true profession. Now, these were the same three traits that I was taught as a cadet, in ROTC, and they have nothing to do with it being someone's full-time job. All the traits that Huntington argued were none of them really require full-time employment, specialized knowledge, control of who enters the profession, and a legal, moral, and ethical obligation that can be enforced by law. Enforced by, if you violate it, you can be held legally liable and punished. Those are the three criteria of a true profession. Doctors, attorneys, professional military officers, usually considered to be in the regular forces. But in the American system, because as either a reserve officer or a National Guard officer, as a reserve component officer, I have to meet the exact same educational requirements and training standards as any of my active duty counterparts. I have to take the same, I have to meet the same performance standards, and the same body of officers control whether I get admitted to the profession or not. And ultimately, if I fail in my duties, I am held legally liable for those failures. So the distinction between a professional, and here's where Huntington says, well, the reservist can never attain the professional knowledge. It's too complex. Well, we have generations of experience that show exactly an officer who commits to learning their trade, in fact, can be a reservist because they have to meet the exact same standards, whether they're reserve component or not. So when my students ask me about service, and I get service students will come and says, oh, Dr. Summers, I'm thinking about the military. And I always ask them, what is it? What do you expect? Why do you want to serve? And what do you expect that consequence to be? And they'll tell me, and sometimes is, well, I want the benefits. I want some experience. I want some adventure. And I says, yeah, it can do all of those things. And I always tell them that my stock phrase is, for me, the Army is, if you'll pardon the expression, a bitch mistress. She takes and she takes and she takes and she takes, and she almost never gives back. But when she does, she has this uncanny ability to make you forget all the times she treated you like dirt. I have a love-hate relationship with the Army. I will admit, Paul, if the phone rang right now and the Army said, Colonel Summers, we've reviewed your records. You have a particular skill set that we need. Will you accept recall to active duty? Lord, forgive me, and my wife would skin me alive, but my answer would be yes. And I'm almost embarrassed to say that, because, again, when I wanted to keep serving, it was the Army that said, thank you very much. Good luck in your future endeavors.
Same thing happened to my sister. She remained captain. She was stuck at captain for a while. She went in the private sector, and then later they called her up, and they ended up, when she passed away, she was in charge of the Canadian intelligence division.
Right. And no, that relationship is one, like my roommate, I had to have this conversation with them because I'm about a year away from sitting for my CPA. So I've done a bit of public study for the military stuff. And my roommate is a Marine, and he was a grunt, did a lot of fighting in Afghanistan. And he was really adverse to the idea of claiming his benefits, his disabled benefits, even though they're rightfully earned, and the injuries he suffered were in combat. And he said, well, somebody else might need him. And I'm like, you're somebody else, dumbass. And I would tell them that whenever they run the sheets on a guy like him, they send you to war with the idea that you're going to come back a quadriplegic, staring at a ceiling for the rest of your life. And the fact that you came back alive, well, able to do a job, means that you just saved this country money, because they planned for you to be a vegetable coming back. Yeah. And you don't need to feel bad about taking what is earned by you. You volunteered at 17 to be a Marine. You did your part. It's your obligation to say, what can you do for me now? Because you put your service first. The military didn't do anything for you to join. You provided first. You are not in the wrong to say, okay, where's mine now? And you're not selfish for that either. And it's all worked into the pie. And some people seriously have the feeling that they're taking from, other people who might need it. It's like, no, these are your benefits. You've earned them.
That is not an uncommon. I've encountered that with many of my own soldiers. I understand it from firsthand experience. And Paul, it is difficult for me to try to explain it in simple terms, other than to say, yes, that is how we often come away. And that it brings us almost back to where we originally started the conversation, is the Army for easily the last 10 years has attempted to appeal on a very selfish basis, meaning appeal to potential recruits by promising them benefits and downplaying what their exposure was, without ever really discussing that ultimately, why do we do this? Ultimately, I know in my own experience is that the soldier in the field, the Marine on the beach, the sailor on that deck plate, when the rounds are flying, you simply don't think about the big national strategic objectives. You may have in mind what your commander has told you we need to accomplish this day. But what really drives you is that soldier on your right and on your left, or that Marine in the sand next to you, and the constant beat in your head is, Lord, don't let me fail them. Don't let me let them down. They're counting on me. I'm scared, but they're counting on me. Don't let me fail them. And that's what drives them.
Verbatim, almost what my roommate says. Yep. You're right. That is the sentiment shared. And
you have to find that not everybody has that. How do you find that among young people, particularly in a society that for decades now has told them there's nothing worth sacrificing your safety, your comfort, your future for? There has to be that higher idealism that gets molded into, Lord, don't let me fail these two. I don't have an easier pat answer.
Right. No, and it's true. And that is the fact is, it doesn't come about until you do your basic training, and then you go through those experiences and you have that upbringing, specifically at a young age, where these are the people that you like, because a couple of years in this, you've spent a third of your life with them at that, respectively. But yes, again, it comes down to the generation, like my generation. It isn't so much, it is a piece of it, but there's all the other aspect. And sort of my point of view is, it's not what's worth giving myself for. Is Joe Biden worth giving myself for? Absolutely fucking not. Because that's even among conservative young men. For Trump, yeah. For Biden, hell no.
Well, often we don't. Traditionally, militaries will become, the fleet is the fatherland, or we are not concerned about that. Especially like people like the Foreign Legion and other places. The United States has managed to avoid some of this stuff. Britain, one of the benefits of the Canadian-British experience is that you do not have the problems with family being constantly shifted around deployments, because you belong to a regiment, and your entire career will probably be in that regiment.
Yeah.
And you have the fact that your regiment has a club and a home and a base, and the family's there all the time, and they're constantly training at that section. So you get this esprit de corps that is like, you're doing this for the regiment, which unfortunately the United States doesn't have as much of. I mean, the Marines seem to have a little bit of it, but there's
the Marines. Yeah, the Marines, institutionally, the Marines do a much better job of it. They're a much smaller organization.
right.
You know, when we talk about the Marine Corps, yeah, we're talking about a corps, and they had, dare I say, the luxury of reinventing themselves when they need to. Which it's not that the Army doesn't try that, but the Army has so much broader range of theater and institutional level missions that they're a bigger organization, and there are enough different subsets within the Army. When the Army consisted of 15 or 20 regiments, I mean, the U.S. Army had a very similar structure to the British Army,
Right.
all the way through until the 1930s, and it was only when the Army had to expand to fight World War I and then World War II. Did the regimental system fall apart? And then, of course, in the 1950s and you know, for about 10 years, the Army tried to completely reinvent itself to match the advent of atomic weapons, which completely screwed up everything, and it's never really quite recovered that. Believe it or not, in the National Guard, regimental alignment is although it's not formally instituted, it has the functional equivalent that you do find that the benefits of the regimental system, you do find that in the National Guard. You really don't have it in the active Army in any effective way. But it is. But David, you're exactly right, and I know that the very few times I've gotten to work with Canadian forces, that because the Canadian military is so small relative to the overall populace, that whether they intended it or not, they kind of have that same intimacy. Dare I use that word?
Oh yeah, no, it's a thing. I mean, like I was just doing we had a Remembrance Day celebration a few weeks ago, and we had 4 regiments marching down with their bands down the street. It was kind of cool to see that, and it's just, you know, you're just thinking about the ways to make things better. I've done a little reading on the Foreign Legion, and they had a similar situation. But basically, the idea that the Army itself is a nation unto itself, or the military, it allows you to do these things where you wouldn't necessarily, if you're attached to a unit and it's been your family for 15 years.
Yes.
That's definitely a reason why you might want to stay in that unit instead of going off to work for Amazon or something like that. It's all about really building up the tradition of Spirit Corps, and unfortunately the United States doesn't seem to have that as much as it should. And you'd think after all this time, but I also think certainly I think what's the act, the one that required jointness? Goldwater Nichols. Goldwater Nichols has had a massively bad effect.
None, yeah. I know.
Trying to build that
joint. Oh, flipping! The name's on the tip of my tongue.
Yeah, no, it's the Goldwater Nichols Act, and it's
Goldwater Nichols. That was it.
Yeah, and the two of I know what they were trying to do and get to get the services to work together. I get that, but the effects of that, especially the idea that if you don't get promoted, you're going to be kicked out, also has a problem. Like it used to, because like in the British and Canadian Armed Forces, a lot of times people will be like, "Why do you want to leave your company? Why would you want to be promoted up the chain? You're doing this. Like you can be a company commander your entire career, and that'll be it. That's all you want to be."
Right. No, and the thing is, what damages the Esprit de Corps, and this will be my final comment, and then I'm going to zip it. What hurts the Esprit de Corps in the U.S. military is things like Afghanistan, where underneath all those generals and colonels having the decision making that they were making in Afghanistan, the mistakes that were made are sergeants, in E1 or E2 to E4s, lieutenants, first lieutenants, all looking up and saying and seeing this happen from a mile away and thinking, surely there will be some consequences.
Yeah.
And then nothing happens. And then there's a loss of respect there, because it's like, oh, I would get grilled for not having my uniform done, but you just took action that got people killed. And it's the, wow, I don't know if I feel comfortable, serving under you anymore, or serving. I don't feel as comfortable serving under you, because I've seen what you can get away with, and I know what you won't let me get away with.
Hmm.
It's a perspective.
And that is an aspect of the American character that goes back 350, 375 years. I mean, that we've got 175 years of military experience from when the first colonists arrived and began having to deal with their own protection on the frontier, where even that frontier was the Atlantic seaboard, 12 miles in on the Virginia beach. But from that, because our entire military experience, the first 175 years, was all predicated upon a citizen soldier militia model.
Right.
And that the battlefield leaders who lost the confidence of their men, even, I'm not saying that every officer should be elected by the company,
right.
Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is we have this cultural expectation of you as a leader. I have a right to expect of you what's demanded of me.
Right.
Now, that's completely foreign in any number of other nationalities, other armies, other contexts. And regardless of that, we shouldn't want to be like them. We should accept what we are.
Mm-hmm.
And that which you just described, Paul, yes, that's part of being an American soldier.
Exactly. And the points of history that we've seen it: Washington from the front, Teddy Roosevelt, the president who's on the $20 bill, Jackson, and not so much Eisenhower, but like Patton.
MacArthur's another one. He would drive up to the front and there'd be soldiers are like, the enemy is 50 yards over there, sir. It's like, yeah, I know.
Right. And that's just, and the thing is, the only place you could find that sort of, or at least that sort of person is really seen is now in movies with like Heartbreak Ridge and stuff like that. Where
I will share this one story that I got from a classmate at Carlisle, who it was in the 101st Airborne in the initial push in OIF 1, and what he described is every senior officer had imbued this lead from the front ethic. So in the lead company of that's moving forward to contact, you have the lead elements, and immediately behind the lead elements you have the company commander, probably within 100 to 250 meters. However, in that lead company, it's part of a battalion. And in that lead battalion, from the company, about another 150 to 500 meters, you have the battalion commander, who's right behind the lead element. And in this lead battalion of this brigade combat team, guess what? 500 meters behind that lead element is the brigade commander. And among the brigades that are moving in this combat march to contact, who's right behind that lead element in the brigade? The division commander. So in a single line of movement to contact within the leading kilometer going into battle, you have company commander, battalion commander, brigade commander, division commander stacked up within 1 kilometer because they're all seeking to be leading from the front. Now, I'm not disputing. I mean, we laughed about it because we've got this room full of all of these colonels, and in the class, one guy who actually did end up becoming a lieutenant general. Also a classmate who was there, who the following year, as a lieutenant colonel, regular Army, 3rd generation, West Point, resigns his commission, goes to work for AutoZone as a logistics specialist. He was an infantry officer, but he goes to work. He punched out before he made 06.
Wow.
And he had been the battalion task force commander that led the Fallujah, when the Fallujah spring happened. He was the battalion commander that had led that.
Damn.
And he decided it was time for him to get out.
Wow. And that's, again, goes back to what we were talking about. How do you retain talent? But I'm trying to respect your time as much as we can, but
yep.
Holy smokes, what an incredible show. We're definitely going to have you back because we can go another hour.
Oh yeah, I know. That's the great thing about when you bring the right people on.
I hope you enjoyed your time on.
Thank you. Any talk to any old soldier and says, well, do you love talking about the service? Do you love talking? Oh, it's just no, it's not the one. It's just, well, if they tell you that, they're lying.
Yeah, there's a great music video I'll have to send you later, Clark. It's a rock and roll song about I really miss this stuff. And it's about two of the special forces guys just like talking about how awful Afghanistan is and how much they miss it.
As I said earlier, I have a love-hate relationship with the Army. And Lord forgive me if they called me back, even knowing that the bitch mistress hasn't changed. Mm-hmm. I would go back, and if there was something I could do to contribute, if it was in training young officers, going back to being in a training command, if the Army called and said your country needs you again, it would drive my wife crazy, but she knows I would do it.
So, final question before we wrap up, unless David wants to add a bit.
No, I think this is good for this final question.
All right. What is your favorite class to teach? It could be like 2 or 3 if you have a pair. If it's
I enjoy them for different reasons. I really do enjoy teaching my basic American Constitution class. It probably is the best example of why I over the course of my teaching career, I went from teaching middle school to high school, back to middle school, and then made the jump to college. And I wanted to teach at the college level, having realized it really is the college level is the last chance we have to change or fix. If we're going to shape them, it's going to happen at the college level. Because at least here in the U.S., the K through 12 school system has gotten so screwed up. But the last best chance we have to shape them before they go out into the world. And so I really enjoy teaching the my introductory U.S. Constitution class because I love all the history that goes into. And we start with the colonial documents. We take it through the formation, what happened in the American Revolution, not all the battles and everything, but what the outcomes, and then the development of the Constitution with all of the amendments and the key Supreme Court decisions that have shaped the Constitution. I really love that. I really enjoy it. I love each of my international relations classes because, again, I have a degree in international relations, I have strategic studies, and, it's with the students seem to, because they're all taking those classes because they want the minor. So with my American Constitution classes, it's a core class. Every student has to take that class. So I'm one of a half dozen of teachers who teach this class. When it comes to the international relations and foreign affairs, It's pretty much me. There's a couple of other teachers who teach courses that apply to it. I think maybe the best answer is only occasionally do I get to teach the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. And I love teaching that class. I only get to teach it occasionally when the Honors College and the History Department have enough demand that they need a third instructor. So I get to step in and teach that when I get the overload, and I love teaching that class.
You know, the guy we had on last would have loved to take that class under you, Owen. He loves that part of history, and it's cool that you guys share that sentiment because he has that same giddy passion for it too. But David, do you want to?
I think that's a great way to wrap this up. I think that's always a good way to go. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week when we'll have another new guest. Hopefully, I have one in mind.
And Professor,
thank you very much for inviting me. I really enjoyed it, gentlemen. I'll look forward to seeing it out in the interwebs.
I think it's going to look great, and best of luck on your finals and taking care of the students.
Thank you very much. I hope they do well.
Okay. I'm sure they will. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.